Hello, I'm Alan Bates, Urban Forester for the City of Hot Springs. Today I'd like to visit with you about crepe myrtle and their care. Crepe myrtle is a very unique plant in our city and very prevalent around our city, but there's always questions every year I get asked on how to prune them and when to prune them. The when to prune them is very easy. Usually we wait until the end of season, which is in here, hard to guess in Arkansas, but usually around the end of February, 1st of March is the best time to prune your crepe myrtle. The how to prune your crepe myrtle is always the big question. Lots of trees around our city have been cut off at the waist high and have the really ugly stubs sticking out of the ground this time of year. We're going to talk a little more and show you a little bit about how to prune them, but I would like for you to see some in our city that are really good specimens. These trees behind me here on Central Avenue in front of the Arlington are trees that have not been pruned in several years, but yet you look at them and they're really beautiful trees all throughout the year. The bark this time of year, if you look at them and the structure of the tree and the landscape, is really a nice in our settings here in the city. So we want to leave here now, go out and look at a crepe myrtle that does need pruning and talk a little bit about it and how to do that. Well, we didn't have to drive far till we found a crepe myrtle that was needing some pruning. When you decide to prune your crepe myrtle, a few things you may need is a pair of loppers to get your large limbs, a handsaw that works very good when you have to remove a large at the base of the tree, and then your little hand loppers to keep handy on your side just to get your small limbs. Here's a crepe myrtle that's been kind of neglected. And so we're going to look for some things that how to prune this and give you a few points on how to prune it correctly and for the longevity of the tree. First thing I notice when I look at the tree is the limbs, the multiple stems. If we were to prune this tree early in its life, we would have started with 5 to 3 to 5 to 7 stems and try to keep an opening in the middle for airflow. Airflow is really important in crepe myrtles. They can get a disease that's a fungal disease that can be caused by the lack of airflow in the middle, and then over time they lose their leaves early or prematurely. This tree has, the first thing we look at, we see these limbs that are rubbing. This would be a prime candidate to remove. Because they are rubbing, that over time, this will be a place for insects and disease to get into the tree. So this is the very first thing we would look at and remove. We would remove it at the base of at the ground level. We take our little handsaw and get in here and remove it right at the ground level. That would be a prime candidate. Always look, the rules of pruning are the 3 Ds: dead, diseased, and damaged. That's what you look for first. And any trees that are rubbing, limbs that are rubbing together. So we would take that out, remove it, go in, try to get an odd number. In landscaping, we always use odd numbers, either 3, 7, 5, any of those numbers there on trunks that we would leave. We'd take those out. We would take away any of the small brittle limbs here. They would come out also. Any of these that are, if you look in the interior of the tree that is crossing over, like such as this one growing back into the tree. Now here's what's real important in cutting. You always cut at a juncture, whether it's at a node or at what we call the collar of the tree. Here is where this little limb would come off, would be at the collar of the tree. Now you have a good clean cut. That's an area on this tree where it will heal. Trees compartmentalize their wounds. This one would heal over. If we could look right over here, here's some in the past that have been healed, cut properly, and they've healed over. These, on the other hand, have been cut and left what we call a stub. If you look real close, this stub is diseased already or rotting, and if you leave these, this is a prime place for disease and insects to get into the tree and cause damage. So what we would do here to correct this is come back at the collar, take it off with a good smooth cut. We're going to do all 3 of these. clean this tree up a little bit. Here's one that you can see it's been left just a little too long. So those will heal over. This tree is already starting to exfoliate the bark, which is one of the main things we like about the trees in the wintertime. The good examples we just saw over by the Arlington showed some beautiful bark on them this time of year. The big question about crepe myrtles is most people don't know is that there are 8 different sizes of crepe myrtle. Everything from a shrub all the way up to the large trees we just saw over at the Arlington. So the best way for the lowest maintenance on your tree is to get the correct tree in the correct spot. So if you have an area, what happens most of the time is people plant large crepe myrtles where really they want a small one, then they have to come back and you see the heading off and the cutting off of the tree about waist high with the ugly knobs every year. So finding that right tree, now there's a really good database at the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension website that has all that I just talked about on it, and it will show you the trees, their size, their color, everything about them. So that's a really neat spot to go. It's the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension website. That's a really great thing. We're not going to completely prune this tree today. It'd be a pretty good undertaking. So I would like to take you to some trees that have been what we call headed back, or the most common term you hear is called crepe myrtle. These trees have been headed back. And when you head back a tree like that, that causes a lot of stress. And so one of the big problems we see here in Hot Springs now is the crepe myrtle bark scale. The crepe myrtle bark scale, if you have a crepe myrtle that's turning black, then that's from the bark scale. We're going to show you a prime example of that, and I'll give you a little hint on how to take care of it. Well, we found a tree of crepe myrtle that in the past has been headed back. And when you head back any tree, it stresses it. And what you get once you head back is you release the growing buds that are hidden underneath the bark of the tree. And instead of one stem coming back in that spot, you get multiple stems. If you look at all the thick growth in here. Well, that's pretty problematic in a couple of ways. One, I think I mentioned a little earlier about disease such as fungal diseases. That has to do with airflow. But what we're looking at here is a severe case of crepe myrtle bark scale. Bark scale is a new insect. It is an insect. It was introduced into Arkansas about 4 or 5 years ago, was our first cases here in Garland County. Started a little more south around toward the lake and has now worked its way all the way up in downtown Hot Springs. So if your crepe myrtle is turning black, then that is what you're having. This is a crepe myrtle bark scale. The black part, or the sooty look to it, is a mold, and it's caused by the feeding of the insects on the tree, and they secrete called honeydew. Honeydew then ferments. This can be washed off the tree. If you were to take some soap and water or just rub it off, it will come off the tree. The sooty mold will. But that's just the byproduct. That's just the byproduct of the insects feeding on the tree. And when you cut them back, as I mentioned earlier, that just stresses the tree and they're more prone to be attacked by the bark scale. So what can you do? Well, the number one thing that we found that helps control them is a systemic, and you can get several different varieties. Imidacloprid is the most common one you will see at some of your big box stores. It's a concentrate you mix with water, follow the label, it tells you how much to mix depending on the size of the tree. Then you pour around the base of that tree, following the label instructions, the amount that they recommend, and it systemics into the tree. These scale are armored scale. They're attached to the tree in the adult stage. And so a conventional spray with an insecticide really doesn't get into their system. So by pouring the systemic around the base of the tree, it works into the vascular system of the tree. And then as its insects feed on it, then it controls the insects. Good news is that is a one application a year, can last up to 2 years after you put it out as far as control. So look for that systemic one in the springtime of the year. Usually April, May time frame is the time you would put that out, when the tree is just coming out of winter, going into its growing its foliage. and this sucks that systemic up. We're getting plenty of moisture for it also, and that can help control your tree problem. So look, if you have the black around your tree, you have bark scale, and that's what we're dealing with. So there's some hints on how to control it. Control is also keeping that tree healthy by pruning it properly. And then if you need to do any type of nutrients, do a soil test. The Cooperative Extension Service is a free service here in town. You can do a soil test for that, just for that tree, and they will give you an analysis back and tell you what to do as far as nutrients, if any needed. Going to have a class at the end of this month. It'll be January the 25th at the library at 10 a.m. That's on a Saturday. I'm going to teach a class on Pruning 101. It'll cover not only the crepe myrtle pruning a little more in depth, but it'll also be talking about pruning ornamentals and the timing of that pruning. You know, if your ornamental blooms in the early spring or does it bloom in the summer, those are all things that are important on how to when to prune. So if you're interested in that, you can check for the library, but that is January 25th, 10 a.m. at the Garland County Library. All right, well, hopefully that give you an idea of some things to do with your crepe myrtle this time of year and some problems you may be having, and hopefully the correct way to prune. Please don't cut them back. So if you have any more questions or any information about trees at all, you can contact me, Alan Bates, your urban forester.